ready to commence. So welcome everyone to this first session this afternoon on tracking carbon productivity. I'll shortly be handing over to A2EP's chair, Kylie Hargreaves, to run this session for us. But before I do, I'd just like to give you a quick recap from the sessions that we had yesterday. We started off with an introduction from Minister Keane, the Energy and Environment Minister for New South Wales, and I think the overwhelming message there was the confidence in energy productivity and the long-term investment and commitment from the New South Wales government. It was great to see. We had presentations from Fiona Simon, the Australian Hydrogen Council, and I think anyone who was a little bit unsure about what's happening in the hydrogen world would come out very well informed after that one, and Fiona was fabulous at cutting through the hype and really seeing and letting us know what's actually happening with hydrogen. We also had a presentation from Heidi Lee from Beyond Zero talking about renewable energy precincts and renewable energy zones and how that's going to impact 1 million new jobs in this green space, and certainly inspirational to know that there's so much opportunity there for Australia with these green jobs. And at the end of the first session yesterday, we had a speech from Mary Stewart from Energetics, and it was great to see when we sort of took a step back and see how much energy productivity and commitments for decarbonisation has moved on in the last 12 months. So that was our first session yesterday, and then the second session we had chaired by Joe Cooper from Sustainability Advantage from New South Wales Government, along with Justin Merrill from Lion Group, Scott Edwards from Coca-Cola, and we also had Sally Townsend from Blackmores. That recording will be out next week. I won't go into too much detail on those ones so we can start this session, but there was so many fabulous tips and tricks of how to get and what happens when you start to kick off decarbonisation in your business and how to get that moving. So really recommend you watching that recording. Kylie, that's enough from me. Why don't we get this session going, and I'll hand over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jared. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's session on tracking carbon productivity. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who might be with us today. As Jared said, my name is Kylie Hargreaves. I'm the current chair of the Australian Alliance for Energy Productivity and deputy chair for Regional Development Australia Sydney. I'm also an advisor on various New Zealand and New South Wales government bodies. My background is actually in international trade, economic development and infrastructure, with a focus on energy, waste and water, and ideally on how to be more productive with all of those elements in order to reduce our impact on the planet. That personal background means that I'm delighted to have the opportunity today to facilitate a discussion with our panel of experts on the whys and the hows of improving our carbon productivity. A very short bit of housekeeping. If you would like to ask a question during the presentations, please feel free to use the question and answer facility at the bottom of your screen, including if you'd like to nominate who you'd like to direct your question to. That'd be really helpful. I will ask at least one question of each presenter just to give the next one time to set their slides up. But please don't worry if I don't ask your particular question. We will, of course, have a proper question and answer session at the end after all three presentations. So, setting the scene. Businesses, as we know, are very comfortable with the idea of measuring productivity. In essence, how do we get more output from the same or from fewer inputs? Traditionally, the focus of productivity studies has been more on labour or capital inputs, although more recently that has included energy productivity, especially because energy productivity can deliver multiple benefits, including emissions reductions, production increases, reputational benefits, and of course, cost savings. But energy is not the only carbon-based input into many businesses. And certainly carbon itself has not been something we traditionally felt the need to measure and manage in the same way as we have measured and managed labour, capital, and energy. But as we all know, this is changing very, very rapidly. In Australia alone, financial analysts are reporting that commitments to net zero targets amongst our ASX top 200 have almost tripled this year when compared to the previous 12 months. Given this trend, it's clear that unless you are tracking your carbon to begin with, then you can't possibly know if or when you will actually meet your net zero target. So, to learn all about carbon tracking for better carbon productivity, let's turn it over to our first speaker for the day, Fadi Geha. Fadi is founder and executive director at Simble Solutions Limited. He is an engineer with more than 30 years experience in enterprise software sales, consulting and mergers and acquisitions. He is the founder, I've just said that, there you go. He served as the CEO for Simble Solutions for more than 10 years. During that same period, he led Simble through various growth phases from a startup to an ASX listed public company. He also served as director of the Business Council of Sustainable Development Australia through that same period. That's a pretty significant feat. Prior to Simble, Fadi held senior management positions with various software and consulting technology companies, including SAP, Accenture, Velocity, and Supply Chain Consulting. He holds a Bachelor of Civil Engineering from the University of Sydney. Welcome, Fadi.
Thank you, Kylie. I'm not sure if everybody can see me yet.
We can see you, we just can't see your slides.
Very good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'll just quickly get my slides going. Fantastic. Thank you very much for that introduction, Kylie. And first, I'd like to start by acknowledging today we meet on many Aboriginal lands. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of those lands and show our respects for elders past, present and emerging. As Kylie very kindly introduced me, I'll be talking to you today about carbon productivity and our experience as a publicly listed company and what we do at Simble in the area of carbon management and carbon productivity. A little bit about Simble, just to kick things off. We actually started the business 11 years ago, and the first thing we did, we launched a carbon management platform by the name of CarbonView. Little did we know that we were probably ahead of the times at the time when we launched. Australia had just launched the National Greenhouse Emissions Reporting Scheme. We kicked into that, and the political climate, as we all know, changed in Australia. We actually pivoted into the UK and grew our carbon management business over there, and decided that we weren't going to give up very easily on the story of carbon reporting. So we actually launched a energy intelligence and monitoring platform to help companies still reduce carbon emissions by technically being more energy efficient. And now we find ourselves 10 years on, and finally net zero is the topic of the town, and everyone wants to understand how to do carbon reporting, and that's a fantastic outcome. We've continued to have operations in the UK and Australia, and our R&D team is actually based in Southeast Asia across both Vietnam and Sri Lanka. But we're here to talk about carbon productivity. So I guess when Jared asked me to speak and present around carbon productivity, I thought, well, that's a really good topic to talk about. Let's just do a little bit of a definition of what it is and how it actually fits into what we do. And really the easiest example to sort of talk about is measured in the same way that labor productivity is. So assuming that same calculation, we would need to look at what are the revenues that a company would produce per equivalent CO2 equivalent or greenhouse gas ton of emissions. And when you look at the denominator in that equation, you go back to the whole point of you do need to report and you need to measure your carbon in order to work out what your carbon productivity is. We've heard from quite a few speakers yesterday about the importance of measurement, and without wanting to repeat some of those examples, but we all know about the targets for net zero from the IPCC, and a lot of those targets are focused on reduction to zero. So on the journey to getting to zero, how do we get there? We need to improve our understanding of carbon productivity. How do we continue to run a business, grow a business, use less carbon on the journey towards zero carbon? And how do we get some insights on how to improve those businesses as we actually reduce our emissions? And I called that, I guess, the new low carbon economy, because whether we like it or not, we still need carbon to actually run businesses, make products, and continue to operate as an economy that wants to grow. And that brings me to, I guess, the intersection when I was doing a bit of background reading for the carbon productivity equations and how we actually get to this improvement of carbon productivity. And I looked at really the two intersections of two major, I guess, events that took place. Paris COP 2015, when it was made fairly clear we need to reduce the global temperature or the emissions in order to stay under an increase of 2 degrees. But we also, as per the SDGs, we still need to actually grow an economy and move more people out of poverty and continue to increase the workforce productivity. So when you put those two items together, which is how do you increase economic growth across the globe, yet how do you reduce GHG emissions? The simple answer, I guess, is you need to improve carbon productivity. We have to wean our economy off fossil fuels. We have to increase the value achieved from each unit of carbon that we use. Hopefully, the economic equation there makes sense. Given our presence across both Australia and UK, I felt a really good comparison, and I'm sure other speakers have already actually covered off both what's happening in Europe and what's happening in the UK. But when we launched our business into the UK, and even when we listed on the ASX in 2018, a lot of the focus was on the fact that we are operating in a global economy, and that our business itself is very much focused on the UK growth around energy reporting, carbon reporting. So I've just put some stats up there just to highlight or explain, I guess, really the differences and the similarities between the two economies when it comes to energy and carbon reporting. As you can see, the numbers speak for themselves. There's a significant base of a number of businesses, of which a very small fraction today is mandated to do carbon reporting at its basic level, whether that's under the Australian NGR scheme for Scope 1 and 2, or whether that's in the UK under the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting Scheme. And Mary from Energetics very clearly outlined, I guess, the differences between Scope 1, 2 and 3 and what's considered to be carbon neutral. But when you look at that, you can understand that the drive for carbon reporting has accelerated. Once again, we saw some numbers from yesterday's presentations that talked about, even on the climate active side, an increase of 150% in companies that are reporting under climate active and setting targets for going to net zero. So that just gives us a good background to, I guess, where we are today and what is needed in order to improve on that. And I just want you to sort of keep that in mind, that 2,500 businesses out of a total of 2 million businesses versus UK 11,900 out of a total of 5 million businesses. When you take those two numbers I just referred to, you can see that there's a very big gap, I guess, and even from presentations we heard of and we saw yesterday from Coca-Cola and Blackmore's, where you could see online, you could see that the large businesses understand the concepts of net zero. They understand the concept of carbon measurement. They understand the concept of productivity. You know, how many bottles of Coke will you produce per ton of CO2 equivalent? So that's all very well understood. I think the challenge we have today, both in Australia and really globally, is if we are to move the needle on GHG emissions, we need to get to that next level where the entire economy, the other 80 or 90% of the economy, understands how to lower their emissions and understands the concept of carbon productivity. A lot of the calculations around carbon productivity are all linked to Scope 3, which is where most of the emissions in most companies are. And our view on it is, if you're not including Scope 3 in any calculation, then you really are not even doing carbon tracking, let alone understanding carbon productivity tracking. And that's why we launched the Carbon View product when we did, you know, all those 11 years ago. I wanted to highlight a couple of really quick examples of larger clients, one in Australia as a very well-known brand, Bayer, and the other one in the UK, headquartered out of North England with 20 operations in 20 countries. In both of those cases, they use CarbonView to do what they deem to be an entire value chain or supply chain carbon emissions reporting. So they could truly understand what it takes for them to start their journey and get towards net zero. The key takeaway for me when working with the larger clients, once again, was this question. How do you go about getting those remaining 2 million businesses, less than 2,500 are mandatory reporting, less than 180 that are doing climate active reporting? How do you take them on the journey? How do you take 5 million businesses in the UK on a journey towards carbon reduction and carbon reporting? And being a software company, being, I guess, a disruptive software company, we felt that the only answer was to basically shrink wrap the product that we launched 11 years ago and make it available to even the corner store if they wanted to do their own carbon emissions. And only that way could we really feel that carbon productivity as an economy-wide program could actually succeed. So I just wanted to leave you with those thoughts around how, you know, a software company's view on carbon tracking, carbon productivity reporting, and carbon measurement overall fits in. Thank you.
Fadi, thank you very much. I might ask you a couple of questions while Matt sets himself up. We had one from Wendy Cox, just your thoughts about whether or not Australia might get to making Scope 3 reporting mandatory.
Look, that's a really, really good question. I don't know whether Australia at a political will get to that, but I think what we're seeing is corporates and associations and local governments and state governments are taking the leadership in reporting, disclosing, and heading down the path of obviously carbon neutrality in one form or another. I think what's happened in the US with President Biden coming into the scenes, what's happening in Europe and the UK is driving that, but I'm not quite sure the political will has arrived yet in Australia to do that. But companies continue to lead, and that's an exciting outcome as it is.
Might ask a follow-on question from that in terms of there's a range of if it's not mandatory, there's a range of different frameworks that are available for people to do sort of, you know, accounting and tracking and, you know, all that and reporting. What's your feeling about, you know, the kind of systems people should use, particularly in SMEs? Should they be looking at the very recognised international frameworks for doing it, or should they be looking at, you know, local systems? What's your thoughts?
That's a really good question, Kylie. And actually, one of the speakers yesterday, I think it was Scott from Coca-Cola Europe Pacific, went, it's more important to get consistency over accuracy at the big end of town of reporting. And to a certain extent, I agree with him. I think the point of software, and obviously I've got a biased view around using software to standardize and scale reporting, it makes more sense to at least be consistent with your reporting. You know, if you don't get it 100% accurate because you haven't got all the data inputs into the software product, that's okay, but at least you're having a go and you can understand, you can get insights and you can start doing something about it, rather than try and aim for getting every single item correct and every single standard incorporated and then basically finding it too hard and stopping. I think the key thing is we need businesses engaged on this journey.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, Matt Drum. Matt is the Managing Director of Ndevr Environmental. Since 2007, Matt has dedicated his career to working on climate change issues with the sole focus of helping the economy transition to a sustainable future, primarily by reducing carbon emissions. Matt founded Ndevr Environmental back in 2010, and it's this decade thing's happening, isn't it? Founded them back in 2010, and under his leadership, Ndevr has grown from a sole consultancy to a market-leading team of professionals specialising in climate change, energy and the broader sustainability fields. And a fun fact about Matt, which he excluded from the bio that he sent me, is that he is also one of Australia's most active registered greenhouse and energy auditors. So that probably explains why this topic is of a great passion to Matt. Thank you.
Thanks, Kylie. And it is sometimes difficult to get passionate about audits, but I've been able to find a way over the last 10 years to do so. Thanks for the introduction and Fadi, great presentation. So with my presentation today, and I would just as a little side note, love to circle back, Kylie, on some of those questions and statements around Scope 3 reporting, carbon accounting, and reporting across Scope 1, 2, and 3 has been a bread and butter service line for ours for a number of years. So I've got some pretty strong thoughts on certain aspects of that. But I'll fire into my presentation. What I'm looking to focus on today is a real trend that we're seeing in the marketplace, and it's an increased uptake of industrial scale emissions reductions projects. So, you know, we're talking heavy manufacturing, mining, resources, et cetera, for a number of years. The Emissions Reduction Fund, which is the government's, I suppose, centrepiece for emissions reductions policy across Australia. I won't go into how it works in detail, but it's essentially a taxpayer-funded subsidy to pay emitters to reduce their emissions and create carbon credits which have a commercial value. But what we're seeing is a really swift uptake in interest and implementation of really large industrial scale projects, which is what it's all about for us. At Ndevr Environmental, we very much focus on the large emitters. You know, I'm talking about organisations that have an emissions profile in the hundreds of thousands and millions of tonnes CO2 equivalents per annum. We find that's where we can really have the impact. These guys have got the big problems and the big opportunities in that transition piece that we're interested in. And what's driving some of these reductions? Obviously, climate action has become an understanding of opportunities and risks is really becoming BAU for businesses. Investors and other stakeholders are really applying pressure for organisations to reduce their emissions, and there's an expectation that a large, sophisticated organisation understands its climate risks and understands its opportunities over a long-term lens. And we're looking at climate change through a long-term lens. It's not a 3, 6, 12-month horizon like a typical forward-looking strategy might be, or budget cycle. We're talking out to 2030, 2040, 2050 in that piece. Emissions reduction targets, including net zero and SBTs, are really taking off because they're underpinning some of that action and providing some structure around how organisations can move, and I suppose some guidelines and foundations. I'm not going to go too deep into net zero and SBTs. I know there's been a lot of discussion on them yesterday, and Carolyn's going quite deep into SBTs, science-based targets. So I'll steer away from that to a degree. There's also been a lot of talk recently about future trade barriers, particularly into Europe, and the CBAM proposal, which is making a lot of people in the free trade space and trade organisations sitting up and taking notice. We're seeing new revenue streams develop for industrial scale carbon reductions activities, primarily underpinned in Australia by the Australian Carbon Credit Units, which we call ACCUs, which are essentially our offsets. The price for ACCUs and the demand for ACCUs is increasing very, very quickly, well and truly above and beyond some of the most bullish projections that we've seen over the last 6 months. We're quite close to the market. We see a lot of we get insights into a lot of trades of volume in the market, both with international units and particularly domestic units, and it's been quite staggering to see that price increase. The price increase of ACCUs obviously has an impact on the business case for a transitional emissions reduction fund project, and it's more and more it's becoming a real focus of that business case. Obviously, increased energy productivity and reduced costs. Typically, if you reduce your energy inputs for the most part, or fuel switch on the other hand, you're going to reduce your emissions profile and your exposure. So what I really want to focus on is industrial scale carbon reductions projects and some considerations that organisations, advisors, tech suppliers, etc., really need to focus on, from my opinion. At the end of the day, and the key takeaway from this slide is that monitoring and reporting of verifiable emissions reductions requires an integrated and bespoke systems and thinking, because there are simply many variables on complex facilities, a number of inputs, a number of outputs, a number of interactive effects that need to be taken into account. I'll run through a quick case study. This is one of the smaller projects that we've been involved in, but nonetheless quite dear to our hearts. MSM milling, an integrated oilseed crushing and refining operation in Ndevr. They historically were running their boilers off LPG. LPG prices were fluctuating quite rapidly, having significant impacts on their P&L from year to year. And there was a decision made off the back of some support from ARENA to implement a biomass boiler, a 5 meg biomass boiler. We did a lot of work working with ARENA, working with the owner, Bob Mac Smith, who's a really progressive guy in this space, and essentially got some great tech, and there is some really strong tech out there in the biomass boiler space. And we managed to fuel switch from LPG, a fossil fuel obviously, to a wood residue from a local plantation project, which qualifies as an eligible renewable energy source for these types of activities. With this site itself, we've been able to save around 7,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalents per annum. Just to put that into context, that's a reasonably big number. The typical Australian household emits around 18 tonnes of CO2 per annum. So it's a project of some scale. And this project is generating Australian carbon credit units under the Emissions Reduction Fund, as I mentioned. So it's a great example of how this new revenue stream under the ACCUs can really offset the CapEx and OpEx that was outlaid to get this project off the ground, which was not insignificant. And we've seen these types of opportunities and activities pop up all over the place. Just some considerations for emissions reduction projects that I'd like to talk to, and what we're seeing in the market again at this large scale. The interest is really increasing, as I mentioned. We're currently working on 4 massive industrial scale emissions reduction projects. Between the 4 of them, there's a volume of around 1 million tonnes of carbon savings / ACCUs per annum for these projects, if and when they achieve their final investment decision and go into implementation and commissioning and start saving the actual carbon. The 4 that we're focusing on at the moment in various stages from pre-feasibility close to FID or final investment decision for one of our projects. A cornerstone project we're working on is with our friends at Orica. Some of you may have seen their Kunang Island project has been registered with the Clean Energy Regulator. We're envisaging, and this is public information, so I'm free to speak to this. It's on the Clean Energy Regulator Emissions Reduction Fund registry. It's looking to save, potentially up to, I believe, 3 million tonne over a 7-year crediting period. These projects have a long lifespan and can be generating revenue for a long period of time. This project is also, I suppose, the cornerstone of Orica's emissions reduction target. They've got a scope 1 and 2 emissions reduction target of 40% by 2030, which is for an organisation that emits millions of tonnes per annum, is a very, very strong and significant target that's going to really require some significant, for want of a better word, beefy type implementations. What we are seeing when we work in these big industrial sites is the typical culprits for carbon emissions, electricity and gas, which have typically been the focus of off-the-shelf reporting solutions and carbon energy management solutions. Don't necessarily tick all the boxes for what we need to work to and understand and be able to monitor and manage over time. When we're starting to talk about big scale projects that are generating large amounts of revenue, we need to integrate and have bespoke solutions to undertake or to capture all these new variables that are coming into play. So, for example, if you're introducing biomass as a fuel source, biomass is monitored quite differently to electricity and gas, for example. There's moisture contents to contend with. We also, in these industrial projects, need to very carefully consider other inputs and outputs and what we call interactive effects that can have a significant impact on the carbon abatement that we're allowed to claim, and therefore the number of ACCUs that we're allowed to create for these projects. So what we're seeing is there's a real need for a bespoke type approach where we're integrating some existing systems and processes, monitoring and managing units of production, understanding interactive effects, still considering our gas and electricity, but also starting to monitor and manage alternate fuel sources and feedstocks. One of the key components of this type of work is it must be auditable. Under the Emissions Reduction Fund, if you don't pass audit, you don't receive your ACCUs. So it's incredibly important that there's rigor, robustness behind the process that is put in place to manage these carbon reductions. So typically we need quite a sophisticated sub-metering and MRV approach, and it's often a combination of tech, off-the-shelf systems, integrating that with production systems, and some quite specialist consulting services to bring that all together in a way that's going to pass audit and create Australian carbon credit units. And when ACCUs are currently trading under the latest Emissions Reduction Fund reverse audit at $18 a unit, MRV becomes critical. You don't want to be leaving ACCUs on the table when the value of them is such. And we are seeing very, very quickly and above all expectations, the price of ACCUs is accelerating, and we're seeing some really significant prices there, particularly out in the secondary market. In the 10 or 11 years that I've been doing this, the last 12, I'd say the last 24 months, we've seen a massive spike in interest driven by some of those drivers, regulatory, non-regulatory impacts that I mentioned in an earlier slide. So that's it for me on the topics I'm keen to talk about. Again, a focus on emissions reduction, which for me is the key to transition. Big, chunky, high volume projects is what we're interested in, but they come at the complexity and they do require a lot of work and have to be conducted in line with quite detailed and complex legislative methodologies issued by the Clean Energy Regulator.
Matt, thank you very much for that. While Carolyn is setting up, I'll maybe ask you to expand a little bit on the ACCUs. And you mentioned in the milling example that it was a critical part of the business case. Can you just expand a little bit more on, obviously that was a big capital investment. How critical was it? What sort of role did it play? Is it particularly complicated to add it in? It sounds like it's, you know, very complicated and robust and all the rest of it. Does that add to the cost itself? If you could just sort of expand a little bit on how the ACCUs can help with the business case, and is it a case of, you know, I think there was a question in the chat. Is it a once off? So yeah, you know, one lot of ACCUs at $18 each, and that's it for the project, or how does it work?
Yeah, good questions. And listen, the carbon revenue is significant, and to have an eligible project, it must be significant, because that triggers what we call additionality. In order to create carbon credits, carbon offsets from a project, you need to be able to demonstrate that what you're doing is additional and beyond BAU, and that carbon revenue has a significant part to play in the implementation of that project. So yes, it is, and it must be significant. The complexities around creating the ACCUs, yeah, they're very very detailed and very there's a lot of traps in 60 pages of complex legislation. For example, if you make some sort of final investment decision, whether it's you know, paying a deposit down on a piece of kit, for example, or entering into a lease agreement for a piece of kit before you've registered a project with the Clean Energy Regulator, your project is void. It's a binary outcome. You don't get a reduction, you get 0 ACCUs from that project. So there's some real tricks and hurdles and considerations there. With regards to how the Emissions Reduction Fund works and timing, it's typically you have a 7-year crediting period. So from the date of implementation, when the project's commissioned and up and running and saving carbon from that day forward, you get 7 years, what's called a 7-year crediting period. Typically, most organisations will report annually and receive those Australian carbon credit units after and retrospectively after they've run the project for a year. So you'll typically have 7 crediting periods quite often. Implement the project, run the project, claim your ACCUs, receive the financial benefit for the ACCUs, for which there are a number of different ways you can do that, and then that revenue stream comes into the business. It's quite different to schemes like the ESS and VUP scheme in Victoria, where there's a deeming process where you can claim your carbon while your energy efficiency certificates up front. It's all retrospectively, which has some downside, because typically when you've got a capital intensive project, it's nice to have that capital up front, but the ERF works retrospectively, although there are some market players that are looking to alternate financing methods and potentially providing some or all of the revenue up front, albeit outside of existing commercial arrangements and the existing structure of the ERF.
So I'm going to try and do something reasonably logical with these questions, but no doubt I'm going to jump around a bit. But let's start with some of the older ones first. I think, Fadi, this one probably came out of your session, and you did touch on it briefly, so feel free to pass or to add to it. The question is, how standard are the formats for reporting between, say, Australian and other international systems?
Sure. I mean, the overarching standard is known as the GHG protocol, which really a lot of the other standards sort of, you know, take components of it. When it comes to how standard is the deployment of it, some countries will focus more on, you know, some components of scope 3, I guess, and that's where it gets a bit more different. And also probably from a software point of view, you know, when we look at it from our side, we incorporate all the standards in there. So based on the jurisdiction, it will default to say which standard you want to report on. And that usually comes from more the international companies, where they'll go, they want to globally report against one standard and then maybe locally report from a regulatory compliance point of view against a subset of that.
So there's some variation, but you can get some expert advice as to which one suits your business better based on whether or not you're a domestic operator or an international focusing business. Probably. That sounds good.
Standards are always different, unfortunately. In
They
some
always
cases.
are, aren't they? Even within, you know, Australia, right? New South Wales to Queensland, for example. The next one I might actually, again, it goes back to this question about, you know, I guess a fear factor potentially around how much cost is involved in actually solving for appropriate tracking. So anyone on the panel who'd like to have a comment, it's sort of around the return on investment, I guess. What's the immediate return for, say, for example, an SME rather than a large company in actually going through this process and implementing a proper tracking system?
Yeah, Kylie, I'll have a go at that if I may. Put my hand up like a good boy. Listen, again, swinging back to the ERF, and as you can tell, the flavour of my discussion here is around large-scale industrial projects, which is where the real problem is with regards to Australia's emissions profile and the businesses that need to transition. So, just for example, one of our clients looking at 300,000 tonne per annum in carbon savings. Looking at the ERF, the latest ERF option of around about $18 per tonne for the units. You're looking at around about $5.4 million in gross revenue by being able to monitor, track, have auditable data. So the business case for that is very, very strong. Yes, you may need to spend on additional monitoring, some sub-metering, some integration, some specialist advisory on how to bring that all together, and crunch some of the more complex numbers. But that business case, as you can see, is quite compelling when you've got up to over $5 million of revenue at stake.
Fantastic. Let's have a look. I think you mentioned, Matt answered some of these other ones about the ACCUs. And then there's a comment from someone around the biomass, which again is you, Matt. You know, an observation on the OPEX savings and the fuel bills and the manpower. I'm assuming all of that factored into the business case, and no doubt helped make you know, the convincing the executives very simple, very easy.
Well, it wasn't very easy because it took about 3 or 4 years to get the job done. Because, you know, some of the reasons it's sort of early mover. You know, there's a lot of considerations. You need offtake agreements for your fuel supply. There's a lot of considerations and a lot of complexity. But that being said, our friends at MSM Milling have been incredibly happy with the results of their project. I believe energy savings of around about 30 to 40% over the implementation period. I think they're into maybe year 2, 2.5 of post-commissioning. So they're ecstatic with the results. There's some other scenarios that we've worked on where organisations have actually had wood waste biomass as a waste product. In the meantime, at the same time, hooked up to natural gas to run boilers. So they've got this wood waste product they've got to pay to get removed, paying natural gas prices, which are all over the place, and we're heading north very, very quickly 24 months ago. So when you're paying to get rid of a waste, that could be a fuel source, and paying too much for a fuel source, the business case is pretty strong. We're seeing more and more constraints around black coal supply. And again, those prices are fluctuating, and the ability to get into, there's more and more wood waste and feedstocks that are popping up. Typically as a waste product, now that it's got an inherent value, it's becoming more and more accessible. You do need to consider the locality and with regards to your feedstock, if it's wood waste. In the biomass instance, you don't want to be cutting wood waste 500 kilometres to your site. So there are some of the considerations that you need to consider, but we're rapidly seeing this opportunity ramp up, and the tech, particularly out of Europe, is for the biomass boilers is very, very strong.
Excellent, thank you. Fadi, we've got one for you, which we're going from sort of the industrial size projects that Matt was just talking about to SMEs. The question is actually about one of your Carbon View product for SMEs, and sort of, does it still include, you know, all the required functionality and features that you might be applying to other projects? Does it still apply for SMEs?
Yeah, it does. Just what it does, it focuses it on by industry, so that, you know, if you're a small business in a particular type of industry or in a particular country, then you'll get your own templates, I guess, for reporting within that industry that you're in or the location that you're in. So you're not getting all the other standards to worry about.
Did you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I accidentally put my hand up or my hand's up. And I do have a lot of thoughts on this. We typically, there is complexity with regards to emissions reduction fund projects. Everything you do is auditable. It's got to pass audit in order to create Australian carbon credit units. The methodologies that underpin your project are typically 50, 60 page legislative determinations. And there's essentially just a minefield. So there are barriers to entry. What we typically say when we're vetting projects, if a project, and we've learnt this the hard way, and over a number of years we've been working this space, if a project's not able to create a minimum of 5,000 units per annum, or 5,000 tonne of carbon savings, it really becomes marginal from a pure commercial perspective to cover your costs associated with just running the ERF project. That's excluding all CapEx, OpEx. You need 3 audits over a 7-year period. You may need additional monitoring equipment and sub-metering in place. You'll most likely need technical experts such as ourselves to help you navigate through that process. You'll need ongoing liaison with the clean energy regulator. You'll need to monetize the units and understand what you can and can't do and how to get the best price for those units. So there are a lot of barriers to entry, and essentially the more carbon you are able to save, the greater volume of ACCUs that you're able to produce from your project, the more feasible the project is. Because for us and the project owner, whether you're creating 5,000 ACCUs per annum or 500,000 ACCUs per annum, the effort is quite similar. It's not scalable with regards to solely the ACCUs. Just on whether or not they could and should be made simpler, it's incredibly important. Australian carbon credit units, the most robust units in the world, in my opinion, the most heavily regulated and strongest, if not one of the strongest units in the world. So what we are and the general market players are very cognizant of is that we do not want to risk rigor and veracity of the units and the integrity of the units by trying to oversimplify the activity. So there's a real fine balance there. Some may say it's too complex and it's too much of a barrier to entry, but it's a significant consideration, because the minute there is a concern that the units aren't robust, we've seen that in international units, particularly some of the older units in international markets, where they become questionable as to how robust they are, the market can collapse pretty quickly. So integrity is incredibly important, and with integrity often comes complexity and checks and balances and audits and those sorts of things. So it's a fine line.
We don't want the ACCUs are not the original Bitcoin.
No. And at the end of the day, we're spending taxpayer dollars, right, under the Emissions Reduction Fund. So we want to make sure that our taxpayer dollars are going to real and verifiable carbon savings.
Yeah, definitely. So Fadi, I think a lot of people may be thinking, oh, well, ACCUs might be good and important to the business case, but it's just one element, right? So there's a whole bunch of things that they could actually do. So what's your thoughts on maybe simpler ways that they could actually start their journey. Don't have to build a Rolls Royce to start with. How can you give a little bit of advice about how they could get started on this very important journey of understanding what carbon they use and how to actually manage it better?
That's a very good question there, Kylie. I think what Matt said is spot on with regards to the RF, and obviously those larger emitters and the audit and the verification, and Australia definitely is world leading in that space. A lot of my focus and a lot of Simble's focus has been around how do you go after the smaller companies that are maybe not emitting as much, but may see the world to be quite complicated. And the analogy I use, it's a bit like before the advent of really simplified accounting systems, such as say Xero. You'd be a small business owner, you'd probably do spreadsheets, or you maybe had earlier versions of whatever it may be, and it would have been difficult and complicated to set up. And all of a sudden, a business of 5 or 10 people didn't need an accountant full time. They did their own P&L, etc., and they got an auditor at the end of the year to just do their tax return or what have you. And carbon accounting, I guess, for the medium-sized businesses needs to be as simple as that, and it is, and that's what we do, and that's what we're talking about. But obviously at the bigger end of town, you've got to cater for that verification and exactly what Matt talked about, and you still need that. So it's about getting that balance right. You may do a really quick carbon track project, so to speak, using software, and you get 90%, or you get a picture of where you're at and you go, I can meet the threshold that Matt talked about, and now I really need to go into the rigor. Or I know what I need to reduce by 20% or get some insights to my board, etc. So it's about starting the journey, and I think that's the critical thing. They got to start the journey. Yeah.
Given a beautiful segue to Scope 3, because I know everyone has an opinion on Scope 3. And in Australia, we don't necessarily measure it. I think Fadi noticed that we don't report it, I guess, in terms of our greenhouse gas for projects, for example. Most companies focus on Scope 1 and 2. I know that each of you had an opinion on Scope 3, so I'm just going to open it up and let you guys go wherever you want to go on Scope 3. Fadi, you go first.
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting topic. I think it's fair to say more and more companies are reporting it, and especially the larger ones. And I think some of those examples yesterday talk to that, especially when you get to climate active reporting, you need to do some Scope 3. The balance of Scope 3 and to really be carbon neutral, that's probably less reported. And where companies sort of fall over is they think that that'll get very, very complicated if they were to do so. And it isn't necessarily the case. I mean, the UK led that sort of whole exercise with Marks and Spencer going, there's no plan B, it's plan A, so to speak. And it drove its suppliers to report to them, because that then drove the 3PLs, the logistics companies, to report. And ironically, that sort of drove our first level of engagement in the market over there, because those companies had never heard of that, and they were trucking companies, logistics companies, and going, what is this Scope 3 that I have to report back to Marks and Spencer? So I think Australia is on that journey, and it's being led by the larger brands that are multinational, international brands who are reporting into head offices in Europe. And hopefully what we'll see is that the smaller companies will go, well, we can actually do that. It's not as complicated. We've got automated accounting systems that capture, as Caroline said, talk about the procurement side. We're capturing that data, feed it into a system, and at least we're getting 80–90% of the information, which is better than just stopping at what's my electricity bill, that's my Scope 1 and 2, and I'm done and dusted. Yeah.
And as you say, it's not we're not Robinson Crusoe in trying to map something in the supply chain. There's modern slavery. There's all sorts of track and trace sort of things through supply chains that have long history. So carbon potentially is no different. And certainly we've got international companies that are international countries that are role models for us. So
correct.
That's an excellent point. Matt, you get the lucky last, and then I'll put the participants on notice to get their last questions in before I do a wrap up when ask each of the speakers today to give us their final thoughts on the importance of tracking carbon for productivity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, maybe a little bit controversial on my take on Scope 3, and I'll start at the start. So Scope 3 emissions are essentially Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions of someone else across the economy, right? So if there is a focus, regulatory requirements are obviously the most uniform and the most effective means to reduce emissions across the economy. That's a great start. With regards to Scope 3 emissions, recording and reporting Scope 3 emissions is bread and butter for our organisation. What you need to be very, very careful with regards to Scope 3 emissions is it's nowhere near as refined as reporting of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. I always say it's a dark art. You can go down some very deep rabbit holes on Scope 3 emissions. How far do I go? Do I only focus on the key output from my operations, or do I go right deep into my supply chain with regards upstream and downstream with regards to Scope 3 emissions? Now, some of the issues with Scope 3 emissions reporting is that the deeper and broader you go, typically the poorer the data is that you get. You're making a lot of assumptions. You're getting a lot of default factors that you're having to apply. For example, you might have to apply a default factor against someone's financial ledger spend on an activity to try to estimate their Scope 3 emissions associated with some activity, which are very rubbery numbers. Also, the further you go out into your supply chain, the less impact and ability you have to impact and reduce those emissions as they spread out. So typically, and we report Scope 3 emissions, a lot of our clients do, because there is an understanding and that integration with your supply chain that's important to understand. But we are very, very careful on what emissions we include and exclude in that Scope 3 reporting boundary. We take into account relevance. How relevant is that to our operations? Do our stakeholders expect that we should be reporting on it? Do we have an ability as an organisation to influence those Scope 3 emissions? What is the veracity of the data that we're looking at? And we also look at materiality. So we don't want our clients wasting time on trying to calculate the embodied carbon in the office chair on level 4. We want them to be focusing on material emissions that their stakeholders expect that they would have an understanding of and that they can influence, whether it's via procurement or other means to reduce those emissions throughout their supply chain. So it's a dark art. My focus, particularly again in heavy industry, I always focus on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, because at the end of the day, if we all look after our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, the Scope 3 emissions problem becomes, I won't say redundant, but it becomes less and less of a priority.
I've got Jared raising his hand, but I'm just going to sum up some of what you just said, Matt, which is focus on the big things.
Material and relevance.
Sorry, Jared, you wanted to ask a question or chime in, or both?
I'll ask a question to the panel, and I was waiting for it to come up anyway, but blockchain. Where do we see blockchain fitting in with this tracking of Scope 3 emissions? And I'm not sure who wants to take that one first. Matt's still off mute, so maybe Matt.
Yeah, listen, I'll have a go. As I've probably made pretty clear, I don't see Scope 3 emissions as the big ticket item in the battle to reduce the carbon emissions into the atmosphere. Blockchain can be quite a costly, complex, not necessarily well understood operation. So, to me, it may be the answer, but it may be the answer to a problem that I don't think is the real problem.
Fadi.
Carolyn or Fadi, if you want to
Well,
jump in there.
so I guess I'm seeing examples of blockchain being used for what I'd call power tracking, source of power tracking. So, you know, is it renewable, and if it's renewable, from which solar farm all the way through. So arguably, given that energy is part of a carbon story, you could say that there's an element of really going through a digital supply chain and incorporating blockchain to verify and confirm provenance of source of carbon being created. You know, paddock to plate and all that sort of stuff, who knows? But yeah, why not? If it creates more interest in the story around tracking carbon in order to ultimately do what we all want it to do, which is reduce it, then we're all for it.
So I'm going to ask the panel to collect their final, you know, just do it tagline sort of thing, while I just sort of set the scene again. And if you can leave your parting thoughts with the audience, that'd be great. But basically today we've been talking about, you know, the importance of understanding carbon in our operations. So we need to manage it just the same as we manage labour. And if we can try to, you know, avoid unnecessary waste, reduce our usage of carbon, and what carbon we cannot avoid or reduce, we obviously need to maximise the productivity we get from that every carbon unit that we use in our business. So the challenge with that though is, you know, how do we measure it and how do we manage it? So with your 30-second thoughts on how we measure it and how we manage it, I'm going to start with Fadi.
Well, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, it's get started now, use software, use consultants, use advisors. In the SME space, definitely there's a huge opportunity for companies to do that. But the key thing is, just like the old saying of when's the best time to plant a tree, 100 years ago, second best time now. With reporting, same thing. It would have been 10, 15 years ago was the best time, but start now and get going.
Excellent, thank you. Matt?
Sorry, just unmuting. Listen, if you're a heavy emitter, there is a massive expectation that you're understanding your risks and opportunity for emissions reductions. It is well and truly BAU. The responses are going to have to be quite sophisticated and as I mentioned, bespoke. For each carbon unit left on the table, that's a loss to the business. Organisations are looking to and wanting to track and manage these reductions in line with their P&Ls on a monthly P&L. So if it's a revenue or accrual process or a cash accounting process, whatever it might be, you need to think about the fact that CFOs, et cetera, are going to want to understand what the carbon revenue is associated with your ongoing business and budget on a yearly basis. So treat it with rigor, treat it as you would with any other financial accounting system, and a ton of carbon left on the table is dollars left on the table in today's in today's marketplace.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. That concludes today's session. I'd like to thank our speakers today, Fadi, Matt and Carolyn. I understand we will take a short break, and for those of you who'd like to come back in at 3 o'clock, you can get some tips and trips on how to build a compelling business case so that you can not leave any carbon on the table, as Matt said, and you can make a compelling business case for why you should invest in tracking carbon properly and delivering some other energy productivity innovations. So thank you again for everyone for joining us, and we'll hopefully see you again soon.